But after Ronald Reagan won the election in 1980, I was assigned to the Special Assignment Team, which is the AP's investigative unit. And so I began investigating the issues that were important to the Reagan administration, and paramount among them was Central America. There were wars going on in El Salvador where a right-wing military government was in control. There was a very even bloodier war going on in Guatemala where a similar right-wing government was in charge. And there was a left-wing government, the Sandinistas, that had taken control of Nicaragua and became a target of the Reagan administration and CIA efforts. So those were sort of topics I was investigating, looking at, but in doing so, I began to encounter a group that we now know as the neoconservatives. They were pretty much just coming on the scene at that point, and Ronald Reagan had credentialed them into the federal government, but he pretty much consigned them to Central America. He did not really give them much say in a place like the Middle East where there were larger strategic interests, particularly oil and so forth. There he left James Baker, Philip Habib, and others more professionals in charge, but he gave a lot of say to the Central America policy to people like Elliott Abrams and folks we now call the neocons. And one thing that they were very big on was controlling information. They understood that by controlling information and how the American people received that information, they could control a great deal about how our country worked. And they had a phrase for this. Originally, this was a classified phrase. It was called perception management. And their thoughts were that if they could manage how we perceived these events, that we saw them as more frightening than they were, or if we saw our enemies in the worst possible light and our friends in the best possible light, that we would then respond, and they could control us, because they were very keen on that, because they also had come out of the Vietnam era, and they understood that having the public turn against the Vietnam War made these kinds of approaches virtually impossible for the federal government to deal with. So a big part of what they talked about at that time was kicking the Vietnam syndrome. It was a very big issue to them, how to do that. And they targeted two groups in particular. They targeted the journalists, because we were the gateway. We were the people who were going to be presenting the information, finding it out, and delivering it to the American people. So they went after us. The right spent a lot of money supporting attack groups that came after journalists. They built their own infrastructure. They had magazines. Eventually they had newspapers. They had moved into radio and ultimately to TV, as we know. But that was their idea. If they could build their own infrastructure and attack mainstream journalists, they could prevent us from doing the work we should do. The other group they went after was the CIA Analytical Division, because they were responsible for presenting essentially objective information as best they could to the decision makers in Washington. So they came under attack. And the key thing there was the neoconservatives wanted to make the Soviet Union far more dangerous. The perception of the Soviet Union was far more dangerous than it actually was. And that would achieve a certain series of goals. They could get money for military. They could engage in these brush fire wars in places like Central America and Afghanistan. And those were important elements of what they wanted to achieve. So information was always the key to them. And they came out of some theories, the so-called Straussian theories of the University of Chicago, that dealt with this idea, that the public was there to be manipulated, that the people at the top knew best, they just had to get the people to follow. And key elements of what they developed during that time, first of all, breaking any independence of the Washington Press Corps, destroying the analytical division of the CIA to make them basically become conveyor belts for propaganda, and using this to then frighten the American people. So when I was dealing with Central America, many of these stories I would deal with would be things like how the Sandinistas in Nicaragua were threatening Texas, how there was even stuff being put out about how Grenada, this little Caribbean island, was becoming a strategic threat to the eastern seaboard of the United States. And there were all these efforts to make people very afraid of these very unserious threats. But these patterns, they learned, worked. They were able to achieve a lot of what they wanted, And when they couldn't achieve it, when Congress got in their way, they did Iran-Contra operations, which basically were, they took the laws and ignored them and ran operations behind the scenes. That was the key to Iran-Contra, the executive branch saying it was not going to live by the laws of the land. There they did it kind of crudely, but behind the scenes. Many of the things we now see happening, we've seen happening in the last 5, 6, 7 years, the seeds were planted during that time. And the ability of or the inability of the Washington Press Corps to stand up to this and to challenge it became crucial in how these things evolved over time.